Fantastic. Well, this is a joy for me to be able to introduce our keynote speaker for not only this session, but also in the next session, so you'll want to make absolutely sure to come back. Bill Mowry is a veteran staff member with the Navigators Church Ministry. Many of you are familiar with that, where he serves as an alongside-er coach, a ministry innovator, and a culture builder. Bill is the author of the Tyndale book, The Ways of the Alongside-er. He brings a diverse disciple-making background to his ministry of helping churches to build disciple-making cultures, as a life and ministry coach to pastors and church leaders. He brings a first-hand knowledge of what it takes for leaders to grow as intentional disciple-making churches. Bill and his wife Peggy live in Columbus, Ohio, so they're next door. I will tell you in advance something he's going to tell you, so don't hold this against him. He is a fan of the Ohio State University. Now, hold it down and put your tomatoes down, everybody, okay? Just give the man a chance, will you? He still might become a Mountaineer or a Herd fan yet, okay? In fact, it's delighted to have Bill with us. His wife is Peggy, also lives in Columbus with him, and it practices the craft of gardening, creating a yard and garden that is a spot of beauty in a fallen world. I want to tell you that Bill has quickly become a kindred spirit with me. I've enjoyed our conversations leading up to this. I was just delighted his schedule was able to open up and be here. From spending a summer in Kenya, doing disciple making there, to come back then and transition to Mountaineer culture. Probably this is more of a culture shift than that was. But already, I want to tell you, we've made him an honorary West Virginia Baptist, and I think he's very much a part of us. Yesterday in the pastor's event, when he started talking about discipleship making, beginning with the pastor's soul, he had me. That's what we need to hear in it. We need a fresh spirit, a fresh wind to blow through our souls. And that's what it's all about. We deserve quality, healthy, well, strong, spiritual, vibrant pastors, and they deserve us supporting them and praying for them to be so. So without further ado, I want to introduce Bill Mowry. Give him a hand, would you please?
Thanks, Mike. You bet. Yeah, I think Mike just gave away everything I was going to introduce about myself. So, and somebody asked me at breakfast this morning. Yeah, I am from Columbus, Ohio, home of the Ohio State University. And they asked me, "So, are you a Buckeye fan?" And so I just showed them my alumni ring, and that stopped all discussions. So. And I can't believe Ohio State's actually on a bye this week. This is 2 weeks, that they've been out. So, but anyhow, I appreciate so much the invitation to come here. And I was talking to Mike. I have to admit, you all do this wonderful blend of meeting, worship, encouragement, fellowship, all in one session. And it's very seldom you walk into a spirit like this. I don't think I have ever clapped so much in my life. And that's a good thing. I mean, it really is. I think that it, in Romans says we're to outdo one another in showing honor. And I just have this picture of kind of we race after one another to honor one another. And sometimes, we think if we give honor too much, then somehow we're robbing God the glory of things. So therefore, we choose not to honor one another at all. But I often think, like all of us who are parents, how much it thrills our hearts when somebody recognizes our children. And they honor our children, right? And we say, we appreciate that about your son or your daughter. And I think our Heavenly Father is the same way. So being able to give honor like you've done to a variety of peoples, I think is really admirable. And I don't think, again, I've clapped so much as I have in the last 24 hours. So thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to our sessions together. The topic this morning is the whole idea of walking with me, and it's a simple vision for disciple making. And for those of you that have been around a while, you realize that this whole concept of disciple making, a topic in some ways, is new to the church in the last 10 years. Right now, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds of ministries that major on disciple making. Our bookshelves overflow with books on disciple making, including the ones I've written. We've got podcasts on disciple making. We have seminars that we go to on disciple making. And yet, beneath all of that stuff, in my experience in working with everyday Christians, working with pastors, research that the Navigators have, we commissioned a Barna research group recently to do extensive research in the state of disciple making in the U.S. church. Bottom line, the everyday Christian feels like they feel unprepared, I don't know what to do, or they feel like God could never use me. Even with all the information out there, bottom line, we have these feelings. Can God use me? Do I know enough? And my hope this morning, and actually in our next 2 sessions together, that you'll walk away thinking, Lord, with some little help, I could do this. I could help somebody become a wholehearted follower of you. And in some ways, it can mean kind of taking down some of the pictures that hang in the galleries of our minds about disciple making and hanging a new one. And that's what I'd like to do this morning. But to get us started, I'd like to tell a story. And the story regards my mother. She passed away, I think it's about 15 years ago, actually in the month of October here. And had my family in church on a Wednesday evening. Actually, it was we were at an Awana program. And I get this phone call, and these are the days before cell phones, so it actually tracked down through the church's office, and it was my mother on the phone. Now, I knew that my mother had been ill. We live in Columbus. My mother and dad lived up north, kind of near Sandusky, Ohio, home of Cedar Point, if you've ever been to Cedar Point. And I get this call from my mother, and my mother says, Bill, it's time to come home. And so, we talked for a minute, and we loaded all the kids in the car, and got my sister who lived locally and her kids, and drove up north and met my parents. So they were already in the hospital. And most of my nephews, that is my parents' grandchildren, nephews and nieces, lived in the area around Sandusky. So, you go into the waiting room, and the whole family's there. And so I go back, and I talk to the doctor. And the doctor says, well, your mom's systems are starting to shut down. And soon she's going to go into a coma, and she won't come out of it. And she's going to pass away. Now, we can't predict the time or anything. And so my mother knows about this. And so she says to me, so I'm in her hospital room, right? And outside as everybody's waiting, she says, Bill, I want to say one last word to all of my children and grandchildren. I'd like to say them one at a time. And so I organize everybody, and they all walk through, and Mom has one last word she wants to say to each of her children and grandchildren. And her last words to me is, well, take care of your dad. Now I thought, as a parent, and all of us as parents and grandparents, we want to teach our children how to live, right? And our grandchildren how to live. And I thought, my mother's teaching me how to die. And how to die full of faith, how to die full of hope, how to die full of investment. And she has one last word she wants to say to everybody. And now, so everybody's listening to that last word because they realize this is the last thing that Grandma's going to say. And sure enough, I was the last one that went through, and after that she closed her eyes and went into a coma and passed away about 2 weeks later. Now, in family sessions after that, we'd kind of joke with each other, okay, what did Mom or Grandma say to you? Because you'd notice some things happening. Like my one nephew married the girlfriend he was living with. And I said to Tommy, I said, hey, what Grandma say to you? And he says, well, she told me you need to marry that girl you're living with. And he says, so we got married. He says, I wasn't going to have Grandma come back and haunt me. But when we have last words for somebody, and probably some of you may have not had last words in that dramatic of a fashion like my mother had, but sometimes we have last words for sending children off to college. Maybe they're being deployed in the military. We're saying goodbye to people. Maybe it's some of you that are moving away from your community, and you have these last words. And we have our last words, a lot of times, if I'm giving those words, we think very carefully, don't we, about what we want to say. And that those last words, a lot of times, reveal what's on our hearts, what's really important to us. We want to make sure they hear some of these last words, and we remember those last words. And what I'd like us to look at this morning is some of these last words of Jesus. They're not the last words, but there's some of his last words. And because there's some of his last words, we need to pay attention because they're revealing something that's very much on his heart because he's wisely choosing them, knowing this is going to be one of the last times he sees his followers. So let's turn to Matthew 28, and that's a passage we're probably all familiar with. We call it the Great Commission. And I want to walk through that this morning for a couple of minutes and then draw a couple of observations for you and I on this whole area of disciple making. So let me read this, and we'll kind of walk through this. Starting in verse 16, it says, "Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them." So in other words, Jesus had given some instructions to meet me on this mountain. And so these 11, what did they do? They all showed up, right? They showed up. They went to the mountain. And I think that's a starting point for all of us, isn't it? As we want to engage in making disciples, we just need to show up. Here I am. Lord, use me. They all showed up. And then what happens? Okay, and when they saw him, they worshiped him. So the 11 saw Jesus, and the text is silent as to what that worship looked like. I doubt if they all broke into a hymn, and they probably didn't take up an offering. But what did that worship look like? And I imagine maybe some of them went up and they kind of hugged the master, right? Maybe some of them bowed down before him. We don't know what it was, but obviously it was an act of love and of adoration and of praise for the master. He's present with them. And I thought, this is an interesting little principle here, because they're expressing their love for the master. And I thought, the great commandment of loving God always precedes the Great Commission, doesn't it? That Jesus, laments the church in Revelation because they've lost their first love. And we need to be careful about not losing our first love. But loving God always precedes our action of making disciples. In fact, the idea of making disciples springs out of that love for him. And so they're demonstrating a simple little principle. The great commandment, loving God, always precedes the Great Commission. And then what happens? This is a little tucked in here. It's this little phrase. I hadn't thought much about this before. It says that they saw him, they worshiped him, but some did what? They doubted. Now, I've often thought, what does that doubt mean? And again, the text is silent on the doubt. Traditionally, the interpretation is that the doubt maybe is related somehow to his resurrection. But I thought, I'm not sure what that is what the doubt is about. If you look at it chronologically in terms of the event since the resurrection, this is, I think, the 6th or the 7th time that Jesus has appeared to either all of them or to the disciples in part. So they've had repeated exposures to him. Thomas, sticking his finger in his side and so on. That's already happened. I'd like to suggest the issue wasn't whether this was a resurrected Lord. I'd like to suggest the doubt was about the mission that he was going to send them on. Okay, now bear me out on this, because think about it. Kind of from day one, they knew they were going to go on mission. Jesus says, "Follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men." I've got a mission for you. In Mark 3, it says he chose 12 to be with him, and what? To be sent out to preach. He was going to send them on mission. He sends the 12 out to do what? To preach. He sends them out on mission. In John 17, what's he do? He prays over them, and he prays over their mission, because he's sending them out into the world. Now, where were these 11 men about 2 weeks before? They were all in hiding. They'd fled the master. I mean, Peter denies him 3 times. And so, can you imagine these 11 guys are showing up on this mountain, and they're thinking, wow, 11 weeks ago, I denied him. I fled him. I'm not worthy to be used by him. I'd like to suggest all along they knew he was going to give them this mission. He was preparing them for a mission, and they had let him down. And so they doubted not so much him, but they doubted themselves. Am I good enough for God to use? Now let me justify a little bit more this conclusion as you look at what Jesus says. Okay, some doubted, and Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples," etc., etc. And then the last one, he says, "And behold, I'm with you always to the end of the age." Now, picture it this way. It's kind of like if we, what we call the Great Commission, go and make disciples. Picture it as this book, okay, that command. And if that's his, this is command, this book. What Jesus does is he bookends this book. One bookend is what? All authority has been given to me. The other bookend is my presence is going to go with you. Why would he so emphasize that if there wasn't a need on the disciples' heart to hear that? There's no other command that I found in the Bible that has those bookends. Now, this doesn't in any way mean to imply this is the greatest command. That's not the issue at all. But there's something special about why he bookends this particular command. And I'd suggest that some of the reasons why he's bookending it, because he knows these 11 feel they can't do it. He's prepared them for mission, but they feel they can't do it. And so he gives all authority has been given to him. You know, for a number of years, I traveled to Bulgaria to help Protestant churches and pastors and kind of make disciples in that culture. And as you know, Bulgaria is an Eastern Orthodox country. There are a few Protestants, about 2% are Protestants in that country. And so I got to know I decided I'm going to do a little study, try to get familiar somewhat with the Eastern Orthodox faith. And so I visited, we have a huge Greek Eastern Orthodox church in Columbus. And every Labor Day they have a Greek festival. So I went to the Greek festival. And then they give you a tour, an explanation of the building. And so you walk inside, the Greek Orthodox church, a cathedral, and you look up and there's this huge dome, right? And it's a dome that's made out of mosaics, these little squares of colored glass. And it's a picture of Jesus. He is a ruler of the world, king of the world, the king of heaven and earth. And he's positioned up there. And so every morning when they walk in, it's kind of like I look up, up is Jesus, ruler of the world, emperor, supreme, my king and my Lord. Every time they walk in, they're reminded of that. He has all authority, and so it directs our attention upward. Let me illustrate this idea of authority in another way. That for a number of years, I took teams down to Honduras, dental teams and work teams, and we'd spend a week or so down there. And one of the times I was in Honduras, we'd stay at these motels, kind of a step below a Motel 6, and so a buddy and I that were coming back from a work project, and we're lost. And so I'm with my friend Tim, and Tim's a policeman back in Columbus, and we're lost in this neighborhood, and it's kind of a rough neighborhood. Neither of us spoke Spanish, and so we're showing people our hotel key, and can you direct us to this hotel key? And we finally got directions, but it's some tough places, and so I jokingly said to Tim, so Tim, are you packing? That is, are you carrying a gun? And he said, no, of course not. And I knew that. I was just joking with him. But Tim had no authority to carry a gun in Honduras, even though he had authority in the United States to carry a gun. Jesus' authority extends to all of the earth, because otherwise, how can he send them to all of the nations if his authority didn't extend to all the nations? And so he's showing his men, these 11, who are doubting whether I could do this mission or not, and he's saying, my authority is going to go before you and extends everywhere on earth. And then the other side of that bookend, right? That other end of that bookend says, my presence is going to go with you. So the indwelling of the Holy Spirit within us is going to go with us as we go. In traveling in Bulgaria, one of the reasons I like going to Bulgaria was that probably about 50% of any audience speaks English. And so you feel like you can really get to know people. You can speak without an interpreter. And but even then, that we'd be in positions where it was really great having the local missionaries with us because they spoke the language. And the Bulgarian language is a Russian language, a Cyrillic language, so it's the alphabet numbers are very different from our language as a Latin-based language. And so I had no sense. You cannot make out any of the words. And one time, Ed, the missionary, sends us off to a location, puts us in a taxi, and he says, I can't go with you, but I've written down the address and given it to the taxi driver. And I'm sitting in the back thinking, oh man, what happens here? I'm missing Ed's presence. He's the one that's going to interpret it. Well, Jesus is saying, I'm sending you, and my presence is always going to go with you. Unlike my friend Ed, who can opt out, Jesus' presence always goes with us. And I've thought it's kind of like what Jesus is saying to help fulfill, this command of making disciples. It's like he's writing out this blank check. And he's saying, well, whatever you need to fill in that check, to supply you with what's needed, I'm going to give it to you. I have all authority, and my presence is going to go with you. What do you think that would have done to the hearts of these men who feel like, I can't do this, I'm not prepared, I don't know enough, God could never use me? I think these guys are getting pretty energized. And so it is with us. As we think about making disciples, that sometimes we think, I don't know enough, how can God ever use me? Well, we can learn from the 11. We're full of doubts just like them, but Jesus promises to send us. And he says that to go and make disciples. Now, again, he doesn't go into a seminar after this is all over and telling them what they need to do. I'd like to suggest that because of their experience with Jesus, they had some ideas of what to do. And so Jesus set some example by the very act of including these 12 men initially with him. And so when they came away, they had some idea of what to do as to how to make disciples. So this is what I want to end up with. 4 simple observations here about making disciples that we can observe from Jesus. As the disciples reflect back on how they were discipled, maybe some of these things stood out. One is that Jesus gives them a model. Jesus gives them a model. See, in Mark 3, it says that Jesus chose 12 to be with him and to be sent out to preach. Now, by the way, in terms of the chronology of the gospel accounts, this is about a year and a half in Jesus' public ministry. So Matthew 4:19, some of the other passages we're familiar with are prior to this. In Mark 3, Jesus is choosing 12, and he's choosing 12 to what? To be with him, to enter a relationship with him, enter life with him. And in that day and age, it was to walk with him. And they walked all over the place. And so he's inviting these men to walk with him, to enter his life with him. Now, in a very physical way, there's that walking he's leading them into. But the scripture speaks of walking as kind of an analogy of a picture of a relationship or companionship with God, doesn't it? You're talking about Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. And it communicates the idea of companions walking together in a relationship with one another. And so when Jesus is inviting these 12 to be with him, he's inviting them into a walk with him. And I like to suggest that disciple making is inviting people to walk with us as we walk with Jesus. Disciple making is inviting people kind of in a companion relationship to walk with us as we walk with Jesus. My passion in life is to deprofessionalize and unclutter the Great Commission so that everybody, the everyday Christian, can feel, I can have a part in this. Because a lot of times what's hanging in our minds when we think about disciple making is we think, well, that's what the pastor does. That's what the paid professional does. That's what we pay them to do. So we create a professionalization out of it. Or that we make it so complicated that nobody feels they can do it. One book on disciple making has 30 things you need to disciple somebody in. And I think, I can't even disciple myself in 30 things. And so we overcomplicate it. And I'd like to suggest through Jesus' model that disciple making is inviting people into a walk with him, inviting people to walk with us as we walk with him. And walking, for the most part, is something that all of us can do. I realize sometimes we have physical limitations, but most of us can walk. It's a pretty simple exercise. In where I walk in our community center, it's kind of interesting. On the track, I find, young mothers, pushing a little stroller, with their child on the track. I see elderly folks walking with, a walker. I used to walk, and there was this diminutive little lady, that gray-haired, and, by the way, I shouldn't say anything. When you say veteran navigator staff, next year we're celebrating both our 50th wedding anniversary and our 50th year on staff with the navigators. So veteran's just a nice way of saying you're not as old as you look. But anyhow, so I used to walk this little lady, and I'd kind of walk with her, and we'd talk, and I thought, good for her, I'd see guys that have on the back of their T-shirts, I'm a cardiac survivor. And so these guys had probably had a heart attack, and they're walking to get the exercise. And so walking, I think, is a picture for us to kind of hang in that gallery of our minds as to what disciple making looks like, and Jesus did that. So disciple making is we're inviting people to walk with us as we walk with Jesus. And so Jesus gives us a model. This model happened to me when I was a freshman in college, started as a freshman in college. So I started, I know this dates me, college in 1968, and as I like to say, at Bowling Green State University. If you remember the 60s, I was giving my life to the 3 R's, revolution, rock and roll, and romance. And I'd told God to shove off somewhere in my high school years. And so I moved into my freshman dorm there on campus, and I got to know a guy named Ed that lived on the floor. And we just got to be friends. We shared a lot of things in common. And but there was one thing we did not have in common, and Ed was a Christian. I'd never met another Christian my own age who one claimed to be a Christian and who actually tried to walk with God. And I'll make a long story short. In my sophomore year, through the influence of Ed, my father, a variety of circumstances, God chased me down and prayed for the prayer in my room in a dorm and said, Lord, I want to surrender my life to you. And a couple of weeks after I did that, I went to see my friend Ed. He lived in another dorm, and I knocked on his door, and I said, hey, Ed, can we talk? And so I said, Ed, I think I became a Christian. And I said, how do I know for sure? And he says, well, are you praying now? And I says, yeah. And he says, are you reading the Bible? And I says, yeah. And he says, have you done those before? Have you ever done those before? And I said, no. And he said, well, that's probably a pretty good sign that something happened. And then he says, and this is a question, and it literally happened, that changed my life. He says, hey, Bill, how about tomorrow we meet in the study lounge and we read the Bible together after class? And so we did that, and that began a pattern. We meet in that study lounge and read the Bible together, and over those months of doing that, Ed kind of showed me how to have a quiet time, a daily devotional life. Ed showed me how to memorize the scriptures. Ed helped me to, how do I share my testimony with somebody else? And it all started with that simple question. And Ed was a regular guy, And, he wasn't a pastor's kid. He was just a regular guy. But he invited me to walk with him as he walked with Jesus. Now, I found out later, a couple of years later, that, say, Ed and I can't remember which day it was, but a couple of days prior to that, Ed was meeting with the Navigator staff person. And so that what Charlie was doing with Ed would then do it with me, passing on what somebody's doing with him. And so, again, just a regular guy. We're just regular guys. But Ed invited me into that walk with him as he was walking with Jesus. Now, so that Jesus gives us a model, then he provides the means. All right, got 4 M's here to help you memorize. Gives us a model, then the means, and the means are what? All authority, his presence is going to go with us. And then he demonstrates some making practices, as I call them. Jesus demonstrates some making practices, some ways of life about how to disciple people. And I like to refer to them as ways. Because, for example, a number of years ago, when my one son was in high school, you had the parent-teacher conference, right? And we're talking with the teacher, and the teacher says, well, Bill, your son not only looks like you, he talks like you, he even walks like you. And so there are some ways about my son that reminded the teacher of me. And so if I were to ask you, if I were to get to know some of you, we'd be able to identify, well, that's the way Mike is. There's something that's characteristic about his life. This is the way he is. And so what I like to describe is that there's some making practices that Jesus did that should become ways in our life. Let me illustrate it with a story. I'd gotten involved with a church in Columbus and meeting with the pastor, and we'd been talking about disciple making, talking about some of these ways. And then I found out he was already teaching a course on disciple making in his church. He had about 50 people meeting, and so he's telling me this story. He said, after about our second week, a guy in the back of the class raises his hand, kind of like some of you way in the back there, raises his hand. And the guy says, well, Pastor, I could never make disciples. And the pastor says, why not? And he says, because I'm just not good at public speaking. I can't stand up and teach like you do. So the pastor then, Phil, asked the question, well, how many of you think you have the gift of teaching? You could do something like I could do. And of course, that wouldn't be distinctive of this group, but you know how it is. We ask that question in a class. It's kind of 1 or 2 people, sneak their hands up. And then Phil makes this observation. It says, now, how many of you, with a little help, could come alongside, be somebody's friend, read the Bible with them, ask some questions, tell some stories, encourage application, have a little accountability, give some affirmation. With a little help, how many of you think you could do that? About everybody's hand went up. Just as if I were to say that today, probably everybody's hand would go up. See, what was the picture in that gentleman's mind in the back of the room? The disciple making is primarily a teaching experience in a classroom. But Jesus says it's something different. Jesus says it's walking with somebody in the context of life and of doing life together. So let me share just some simple practices real quick that's really helped me. It's kind of like trying to distill all these years that I've been attempting to make disciples. What are the essentials? First essential, think of a bullseye, a target. And so that as we're discipling somebody, we have a degree of intentionality. And we could talk about how Jesus did this, but time doesn't permit. But I like this little illustration called the navigator wheel. And it's a picture of a disciple. And so that, as you see this wheel spin, what's the center? Well, it's Christ is the center, right? And this wheel captures the great commandment of loving God and loving others. So I love God through prayer and the word, vertical spoke. And I love others, those from whom Christ died and witnessing, those from whom Christ lives, fellowship, and then obedience is what ties it all together. So this is a picture that's in the back of my mind as I think of discipling somebody, that I've got a picture there. I want to help to get their wheel rolling in their life. And as the wheel rolls, you don't see the individual spokes, you see what? The center, which is Jesus. And that's the whole goal of it. So a way about us is that there's an intentionality. We've got, there's some, the Bible is really clear. There's some really important things that people need to know, be, and do to follow God. And this captures some of those things. And so I have a bullseye, a picture in my mind of what a disciple looks like. So think of it, what are these ways? One way is that I've got that picture in my mind. Second way is captured in the letter R, okay? And R stands for relationships. And again, I'm in relationship with people. Disciple-making travels in the vehicle of friendship. In relationship with people, where there's an expression of love, transparency, vulnerability between us, we're kind of men and women living life together. And then, add to the R what I call 2D. And that 2D is wrapped up in the Bible. And so that I like to think of it that as I'm discipling people, there's always an open Bible between us. And that 2D stands for discovery and discussion in the Scriptures. Now again, we're all Baptist. I'm a Baptist. And we love to preach and we love to encourage. But what I'm seeing in Scriptures is that we need to be careful we don't have just a one-dimensional approach to engaging people with the Bible. And the one-dimensional approach is typically the preaching and teaching, public model that we react to. But if you look at Scriptures, there's multiple dimensions of how the Bible is taught. Deuteronomy 6, what's it say as we sit around the table? We're teaching the Word. Mother and father are doing it in the home around the table. We see in the Gospels, Jesus periodically took the 12 aside and interpreted to them privately the things that he had taught. There's a small group interaction around the Scriptures. And then there's the one another ministry in Colossians 3:16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly as you do what? Teach and admonish one another. And so 1-to-1, 1-to-2, 1-to-3, teaching is taking place. So it's not to diminish the pulpit ministry, but it's to flesh it out, to make it larger, and particularly in a discipling context, I'm engaged with somebody 1-to-1, 1-to-2, 1-to-3, and we're exploring the Scriptures together. So there's discussion and discovery taking place. And if you want to get some practical tools on how to do that, it's my session, after this is over. So you've got a bullseye. So picture that in your mind. You got a bullseye. These are some ways. A way about us, and we've got an intentionality. Then there's a way of relationship. Then there's 2D. And then there's 3A, what I call the triple play. Now, I played baseball for a couple of years in high school. And here was my one standout moment as a baseball player. So I'm a second baseman, right? Yeah, let's take another true story. Bases are loaded. And so this guy, the next batter just slams this line drive right at me. And I catch it. Now, what happened, though, is that the guys in first and second had already taken off. I think they thought I wasn't going to catch it. And so the guy's coming down from first base. I catch it and I tag him out. The guy that was on second, where's he at? He's now almost to third base. So what do? Tag second base. What just happened? What kind of triple play? It's unassisted triple play. And as my bright moment, of course, the crowd cheers and and I strike out 4 times in that game. But no, it literally didn't happen. I struck out 4 times. A buddy of mine struck out 5. And in a 7-inning game, that's a lot of strikeouts. But we have this triple play of encouraging people to apply the Scriptures, encouraging a sense of accountability with people, and then giving affirmation to people. And what I'd like to suggest is that triple play of those 3 A's cannot happen from a pulpit or a lectern, particularly in an effective way. I mean, standing up here in front of 150, 200 of you, I have no idea what's going through your heads. I can spot the ones that have fallen asleep already. But, I have no idea what you're going to do in terms of application. And there's no way I can keep 150 of you have a spirit of accountability. And I don't know you enough to know how do I affirm what the Spirit of God is doing in your life and the steps you're taking. But see, if I'm in relationship 1-to-1, 1-to-2, 1-to-3, do you see how that can happen? And so that again, we're inviting people to walk with us as we walk with Jesus. And that triple play, it's just kind of a way of life that we have. These are ways, and again, if we had time, we could see how Jesus modeled all of that. So let me summarize these ways. The one way is that we have a picture of a disciple, a New Testament picture of a disciple, not a picture of our preferences and our assumptions, but we've looked at the scriptures and say, yeah, I think this captures what a disciple looks like. And for me, I just kind of use this wheel. And then it travels in a vehicle of relationship. And I'm taking the time to, by the way, a key thing in relationship, and this is what I regret. Seems like at my age, I end up thinking about all the things I wish I would have done. But a lot of times, what I regretted at times is I didn't get to know people's backstories. Because all of us have backstories, how God shaped our lives. The people that were positive, the people that were negative, the events that were positive, the events that were negative. They make up our backstories. And then when we get to know one another's backstories, we build a relationship with one another. But it doesn't stop there. This isn't a good, friendly society. But we want to then engage people in the scriptures. So there's discovery and discussion taking place. And then we're going to take it a step further. And we're going to practice that triple play of encouraging accountability, encouraging application, giving affirmation to people. So what am I saying? Let me suggest there's 3 things that we can learn from Jesus' example here. One is that he gives us a model. Inviting, we're inviting people to walk with us as we walk with Jesus, and Jesus set that model of that walking. And then Jesus provides the means, authority and the presence. Then he demonstrates some making practices, some ways of life that, again, do you get the picture here? This is not just running a program. It's not creating a checklist. It's not using a curriculum, although those things are all helpful. I have a master's degree, and I can design the greatest program out there. And those are helpful tools. But sometimes we get over-reliant on those tools. So picture it this way. If you're stranded on a desert island with about 20 other people, and some people in the desert island said, hey, I'd like to be a disciple. Now, again, this isn't going to happen. And there's no Bible studies out there. There's no reference books. There's none of my books are available. And all you had was a Bible and some questions. Could you do it? And that's kind of what we're looking at here. There's just some ways about us. And so we build relationships. Discovery and discussion of scriptures, we give application, affirmation, and accountability, okay? And so these are some simple things, some simple ways that we can learn how to do it with people. And so we're inviting people to walk with us as we walk with Jesus, but then there's always the mission. Because the bottom line of this passage in Matthew 28 is that, where were they to go? To all the nations. Now again, in an apostolic sense, they went to all the nations. For a lot of us, we may go to the nations, through our giving, through periodic projects and so on. Some of us may be called to go overseas, and we've heard some excellent stories on that this morning. But probably the vast majority of us, and the vast majority of the people in your congregation, their mission field is where they live and where they work and where they play. And that Jesus is sending them and sending you and me to that same mission field, and that mission field is just as important as an overseas mission field. And they're both mission fields, and he's sending us on mission there. Let me illustrate that by, again, a little story. As Mike mentioned, my wife and I are gardeners. Peggy's a certified master gardener. Do we have any master gardeners in this room here? Oh, yeah, good. So you know what it's about, yeah. And and we've, taken up gardening in our house. And I don't know what it's like in West Virginia, but what does approximately May 15th represent for gardeners? It's a frost date, yes, yeah. And in fact, that in Ohio, that frost date is moving up, by the way, with climate change, et cetera, et cetera. But, so around May 15th, the one nursery we go to, they literally have policemen in the streets directing traffic. All that energy is pent up. We want to go and buy stuff. And so I'm standing in line, and the line is probably from here to that wall, and there's 4 of them, all right? And I've got my cart full of flowers. And so there's a checkout. Behind me is the nursery, the garden center. That's where all the plants are. So I've got all my flowers. Peggy and I have all of our flowers and bushes. And I'm thinking, the goal of this nursery is to get all of those plants out there, to sell them and to plant them in every spot in the community around Columbus. And there are probably hundreds, maybe thousands of homes in which plants and flowers from back here in this nursery is now planted out in Columbus. So I'm thinking about that, and then I started thinking about a couple of weeks before, Peggy and I had been to the Franklin Conservatory. And the conservatory, it's, you go and you visit the tropical rainforest room, the desert room, the bonsai room, the orchid room, and so all these beautiful flowers are there, settings are there, but it's in an artificially created environment. And none of those plants are leaving. And you come in, artificially created, and you look and you admire, and then you go back home. And I started thinking to myself, okay, there's a difference between this nursery and this conservatory. And then I thought, well, which one should the church be most like? It's the nursery, right? And then what God wants to do through your congregations, as you disciple people, and as people disciple people, that we're planting that good seed of the gospel all over this community out there. And the goal is not to stay in an artificial setting like that, conservatory, which is easy to do. A lot of times we think of discipleship in a congregational setting is that it's going to improve the quality of the life of our congregation, and that's true. But ultimately, it's all about mission. Jesus wants to send us on mission, whether it's to all the nations, or whether it's to our neighborhoods, whether it's to our workplace, to our families. With my wife, it's kind of interesting. She sees the women that she regularly associates with through the Master Garden program, the volunteer work that she does. That's kind of her little mission field, as it were. And I'm building relationships with these women, and in time, I want to have some faith conversations with people. And so that as we look at Jesus, we look at these models, that he gives us a model. We invite people to walk with us as we walk with him. He provides the mean, his authority, and his presence. He demonstrates some making practices. He sends us on mission. Now, how about you? Are you willing to show up, which Jesus asked us to? And if we say that we show up with doubts, well, Jesus really does want to meet us at those point of doubts and give us the spiritual resources and the support from the body of Christ to help us to do that. And so you can simply get started. Here's what I encourage people, because you say, how do I get started? And I say, well, just begin praying for one person. Just one person. In my network, maybe at church, maybe it's in my neighborhood, maybe it's my job, maybe it's in my family. I've got a friend of mine that he's been discipling his grandchildren. And so ask God, Lord, just give me one person. And it doesn't have to be complicated. Maybe the first thing you'd want to do is just invite that person to read the Bible with you, kind of like what Ed did with me. And that could then lead into some other things. It could be inviting them into a triad, a group of 3 or 4 people, and we're doing some discipleship things together. Not just studying again the Gospel of John, but we're looking at how can I get this wheel rolling in our lives, and so that it's becoming part of who we are. And so my challenge this morning to you is that, this is not the great suggestion or the great option. Jesus calls it we call it the Great Commission. And it's as simple as inviting people to walk with us as we walk with Jesus. And so this morning, are you willing to show up and say, Lord, hey, here I am. I'm going to trust you. I'm going to look to your model of walking with people. I want to appropriate the means you've given, your authority and your spirit. I want to make some of these practices part of my life. And I want to live on mission, right where I live and where I work and where I play. Let me pray for us. Father, we thank you for this time this morning. We thank you for, on the one hand, that just the simplicity of disciple making. We're inviting people to walk with us as we walk with you. And that walking with you is really critical, Lord. That we want to have lives, as Mike approached it last night, that we are people who are abiding in you, and that's part of who we are. That's describing us. And then, Father, that we're inviting people into that walk. people in our neighborhoods, people in our churches, people in our families, people in our workplaces. We're just inviting 1, 2, maybe 3 people to walk with us as we walk with Jesus. And then we're practicing some simple ways. There's an intentionality about what we're doing. We're building relationships. We're engaging people in the Scriptures. And we're encouraging application and accountability and a giving affirmation. Father, help us to practice these things. And may you continue to build a movement in each of these churches of disciple making. And so that, Father, you're sending us on mission so that we're carrying the gospel to every corner of our communities, because we do it for your glory. Amen.